Hello everyone! In this video we'll go over the decorator pattern, which is a design pattern described by the Gang of Four. Main goal of the decorator is to allow us to pragmatically augment our existing service without changing its code. There are times when you, as a developer, need to add some form of additional functionality to an existing service, be it logging, validation, caching, etc. Adding that kind of code into the service itself would be a wrong approach, but still, most of the junior developers tend to do just that. A library that will help us implement the decorator is called Scrutor, developed by Christian Hellang. You can find it on NuGet with this name. I have already installed it in my solution. And another library that we are going to use is Fluent Validation. For this video, we'll go over two simple examples, one being the iBook repository in here. So this one contains a simple save method that is a proof of concept. The second one is a generic iRepository of T, which contains the same save method. We will be adding validation to both of them. In the second sample, we will use as well the Fluent Validation. Small disclaimer, in my opinion, when you have a cross-service call, meaning a higher level service calls a more basic service, like business layer logic services calling the data access logic service, the data access one should always validate the request. So what we will be doing is basically refactoring a proof of concept interface and service that you might have in your solution. Let me go over to the service. It's nothing more, just a simple adding to a list. In your case, you might be using Entity Framework, you might be using some other ORMs or something like that. Next, what we want to add is basically add validation for this object. So I don't want to have a book without a name or an author name. For that, we will create a small validator decorator, which will inherit from the same interface in here, and basically validate the name, not be an empty string, and if it's an empty string, just throw an argument exception. From the code of the decorator, you might have a number of questions. First one being, how will the dependency injection container not enter a self-referencing loop with the interface, since we are implementing in here the interface, the class interface that we are inheriting. And second one, how will the dependency injection container decide which one should we inject into where? To explain this, we need to go over and see how Scrutor works. Basically, the first step is registering our original service with the dependency injection container. Afterwards, you call the decorate method in the Scrutor library over the interface and specify which will be the decorator. In order to decorate an interface or a service, we need to call the decorate method in our startup class and specify which will be the decorator. We can as well define multiple layers of decoration over an original service, and all of those will be resolved in their defined order in the program.cs. When the class interface, namely in our case the iBook repository, will be injected into a service like our proof of concept controller in here, Scrutor will resolve the dependency using the last chain in our decorators list. Basically, we don't have direct access to the book repository. In our case, in the controller, and book repository validator instance will be injected. In the book repository validator, in here, where we have this interface, Scrutor internally will create a redirection towards the next service in the chain. In our case, since we are only using one decorator, that will be the original service itself. Be cautious, order matters with the decorate method. Scrutor will only decorate services which are already registered with a container like this. So make sure you register your inner services first. Okay, so let's try an example and see how this one will work out. So basically I have here a book I don't want to specify the name, just to encounter the validation exception. Basically, if I try to execute this, I've set up a couple of breakpoints in my solution. As we can see, the endpoint has been hit. So in here we have our book object, which has an empty name. So when we try to execute the code, we see that in here we have an iBook repository instance. Next, if we press F10, we are going to the book repository validator as expected. So basically in here we have the object itself, which will trigger the argument exception, will catch it and return a problem message. Back to the color, which we can see in this example. Name cannot be empty. The same goes if we specify here an name, for example, name like this. Okay, so the endpoint has been hit. F10, we go over the validation. The validation has passed. In here we have a reference to the book repository service. So basically the save book method will be called, and we are hitting our original service as expected. When we press F10, we will return to our decorator layer and then go over to the controller itself and return OK to our API. The next example that we will go over is the generic example. In case we have an open generic interface like this one, the iRepository of T, which might be familiar to most of you, if you are using the repository and unit of work pattern. Basically in here we have a generic book repository which inherits from iRepository, and we specify that we want it to work with books. It's a proof of concept method, so basically we just console log we have executed the code itself. Next we want to add validation using the Fluent validation. In this case we have created a book validator which inherits from abstract validator and has two rules, the name and the author name. Next, inside the generic repository validator, we have the same structure as we have previously, the iRepository of T, which will be the redirection toward the next chain in our decorator pipeline. As well, we have injected an IEnumerable of iValidators of T. Basically, this will contain all the validators that are registered with the Fluent validation for the specific object that we have passed in here. We will create a validation context, count the failures, and return a validation exception to the caller itself. If everything has passed, we will call the book repository save method. In our program.cs file, we will require a little bit more intricate approach than the simple add transient and decorate that we have in our simple decoration. For the generic decoration, we would need to scan the assemblies to register all instances of iRepository with the dependency injection container. This is a functionality that is provided also by Scrutor. So in this example, we can say that we are scanning the assembly of iRepository, which is an open generic interface. We are adding classes that are assignable to the iRepository and adding them as transients as well. For our decorator, we are using a different method. As you can see here, we are specifying the type of service that we want to decorate and the type of the decorator. Basically, in the future, what this will do, if we register, for example, an iRepository of author or, for example, of some libraries, we will have automatically the dependencies resolved. Otherwise, if we didn't have the possibility to scan the assemblies, we would have to do something like this. Basically, we would add the transient, like iRepository of book, and then generic book repository. We would have to do something like this, and then decorated repository of book with the generic repository validator of book, and do this for all the classes and all the repositories that we have in our solution, which is pretty inefficient if you ask me in the long run. If you have just a couple of services, that might be the case, but when you have 10 or 15 different repositories, that will become a nightmare to maintain. So scanning will provide just a little bit easier approach. As well, I have disabled for the proof of concept the validation at the controller level. So now we'll go over to the controller. We have in here a breakpoint. We could go to the generic repository validator, set a breakpoint in here, and in our Swagger API, just try it out. For example, enter an empty name and an empty author. So if we try to execute it, we hit the endpoint, we go over to the generic book repository. In our case, it's an injected I repository of book. Next, we get over to the generic repository validator. We create a validation context. We count the failures. There are 2 failures, and then we throw in a validation exception back at the caller itself. And this is the way the Scrutor works. Of course, there are multiple other tips and tricks about the assembly scanning, but for the purpose of decoration, these are the 2 main methods that you could use in your applications, in your existing services. For example, add caching to an existing service by using the decorator. This is probably the most used approach and problem solved by the decorative pattern. So yeah, thank you for watching and see you next time.